Welcome to another episode of This Is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast. Season 2, Episode 30. Your safe space to discuss sports, politics, social issues, and even religion, where we will take it all very seriously, but not too seriously. This week I delve into spirituality, religion, if you will, again, the relationship between our ego and divinity, and what we see in our ego as being a detriment, or dare I say, evil, can often be a representation of exactly what we needed in the moment, the divine response to our plea for help. And because I feel strongly about it, and it's generating interest, another segment on the waking nightmare, with occasional erections, mind you, that is the dating app experience. Whoever told you there was a generational gap in communication is absolutely full of shit. And there is no need for the metaverse. Virtual reality exists today. Thank you for listening. If you like what you hear, like, subscribe, heart, distribute, do the things. Do the things asked of you by the social media sites. Onwards and upwards.
Act 1, the Ego and Divinity.
As the more astute of you, dear listeners, may have noticed, I'm now giving my ego more credit for the things that it's helped me do in my life, and I've also been trying to recognize when my ego is rearing its head and where it may actually be providing value. In any journey of self-discovery, you're going to be exposed to a lot of different material, a lot of different literature, a lot of different theories and philosophies about spiritual growth, emotional growth, intellectual growth, how these things all interplay. And generally, the ego is regarded as an enemy. It's an obstacle. It interferes with your higher power, source energy, manifesting your goals, achieving your greatest good. And with no real awareness of your ego, I'm sure all of that is true. So if you boil down the essence of what many Christian traditions, Hebrew traditions, Islamic traditions, in particular Buddhist traditions, in particular Hindu traditions, what are they all saying? Are they saying that you need to destroy your ego? Many of the practitioners, many of the spiritual leaders, many of the so-called prophets preach as much. Yet for my part, as I've gone on my own spiritual journey, as I've examined these materials, and being that I'm always questioning things, it seemed to me obvious that the issue wasn't necessarily the ego. The issue was awareness of the ego. When are we in our ego? And what is the ego? Is it a singular representation or manifestation of you? Is it something that's binary? Either you're in your ego or you're not. If you look to more traditional psychological teachings, the foundations of which are in Freud and in Jung, we're looking at a multifaceted ego. There are different representations of you within the ego. Having an awareness of when these different parts of you begin to manifest, begin to represent themselves in the situations that you confront on a daily basis, that awareness allows you to either feed energy to the ego or to tell it to back down. I've said this on the podcast several times, but now I'm taking it in a different direction. This is something that's come through me the last couple of weeks, and I've had a hard time articulating it. I think I've put it together now. It has a religious component to it, and it is something that I've been, again, reluctant to discuss on the podcast because religion is a touchy subject. Having a well thought out, cogent, interesting piece on religious texts or religious scripts within my own life, it's not easy to communicate all of this, to put it all together. I feel this has come through me such that I've been able to sit with it, articulate it, and I know what direction I'm going. So let's harken back to episode 20 of this season, season 2, where I discuss one of the chapters in the Bible, Matthew chapter 4, the story of Jesus going out into the desert. One of the main points that I've been attracted to in many of the spiritual teachings that I've been reviewing, Eastern and Western philosophies, the concept that God dwells within us, that the devil dwells within us. To the extent that God exists, to the extent that the devil exists, they're only manifested through us. They don't exist out in the ether somewhere. Then they approach us at different times. They're always inside of us. And that energy is either being fed by us or it's being rejected by us. And we might not be conscious of it. That's where the awareness comes in. But it's within us. And I want to discuss that concept that God or the devil is within us in reference to something that, if you're a Christian in particular, I know you've been exposed to this. It is not a Bible passage. It's a poem that was written, I don't know when. I actually probably need to research this better, but I'm going with it right now because I'm feeling the flow. It's a Bible passage that, whether or not you're a Catholic, whether or not you're a Baptist or a Methodist or a Lutheran, you've heard this before. This poem has made its circle around Christianity, at least here in the United States, probably all over the West. The Footprints in the Sand poem. And I think it has a lot of different iterations. In some, it's basically this. I look at the last scene of my life, shot before me. I'm walking along the beach of my life, and in the sand I see footprints. And looking back, I expected to see 2 sets of footprints, yet I only saw 1. And I was questioning the nature of things. Lord, you told me when I decided to follow you and become a believer, a follower of Christ, you would walk and talk and carry me all the way. I'm aware that during the most troublesome times of my life, there is only 1 set of footprints in this sand. I just don't understand it. And the Lord whispered, "Oh, my precious child, I love you and I will never leave you. When you only saw 1 set of footprints in the sand, it was then that I was carrying you." Oh, how the suburban Puritan loves this passage. I can remember as far back as the late 70s, early 80s, this being part of the curriculum. Granted, I went to a private Catholic school. Part of the curriculum in 1st and 2nd grade, where you would write this poem out. And I also believe that there were letters that were missing and you filled them in. It was not only an exercise in quote-unquote spirituality, but it was a learning experience. Over the years, I've seen this all over different types of Christian spirituality, whether at churches, whether it's some sort of Christian organized function. It's been popularized on t-shirts, on all sorts of kind of putrid things that you would find in your grandparents' house, a magnet on a refrigerator, a picture on a wall. As you might have intuited, I do not like this poem. In fact, I find it asinine. It never resonated with me. Never. It never made sense to me. I did not find it consistent with any of the spiritual teachings from the Bible. I did not find it consistent with the experience of my life. One of the very interesting tenets, on a side note, of Buddhism is its practicality. You do things, you practice them. If they work in your life, you continue to do them, and you try to become more and more adept at doing them. If they don't work for you, if they don't resonate with you, you stop doing them. It's either practically applied and effective, or you stop. In this instance, I bring up this poem because it never resonated with me, and it's one of those things that I think appeals to those that are very shallowly experiencing their faith, their Christianity, their higher selves. It's that feel-goodery, it's that do-goodery that in practicality doesn't make any sense. Now, why do I say that? All of you are living a life. It doesn't matter whether or not this is the first episode you've listened to of my podcast. It doesn't matter whether or not this will be the last episode. You're living a life. You're having experiences. Some of those experiences have been grand, have been joyful, have made your life worth living. Some of those experiences have been terrible, atrocious, treacherous, and you've thought to yourself, what did I do to warrant having to go through this in my life? Feel into what I'm about to say, dear listener. Feel it. Even where you were going through those experiences and you had the awareness to call out to God, did you feel like you were being carried through that darkness, through that, and to use a biblical term, valley of darkness in those moments? No. Universally, the answer is no. It isn't an experience that we have, and I talk about experiences so often that we have in common because I think it's important. This is another one, but it's not that we have this experience in common, it's that we have the lack of the experience in common. No shallow, prudish, suburban do-goodery is going to make you feel better when, let's say, you've lost a loved one, particularly if you've lost that loved one in an unnatural way. You've lost your job when that came completely out of the blue. You go through a divorce. Your spouse has cheated on you. Your spouse has made you financially insolvent, blown through all the money in the household. You may have cried out to God, why? Help me. I need you. In that moment, did it feel like you were being carried? No, it didn't. But was your prayer not answered? Was your prayer not answered? Now we go back to the preface of this very piece, the ego, and the idea that God is always manifest in us. Good is always manifest in us. Evil is always manifest in us. We look for God in a very limited, in a very human capacity. God has to look to us like what he, and I use that intentionally because God is always referred to as a he, even in churches today. You very rarely get the she. God is referred to as a he. We have these pictures in our head that are manifestations really of artist renderings that have nothing to do with the vast nature of what a true God would be. We don't allow for anything different to manifest, and therefore we feel like we've been abandoned. What if these different parts of your ego that you developed in those times of crisis, in those times of despair, were the Lord answering your prayer? This is how you're going to get through this situation. We can all relate when it comes to death, but not all deaths are equal. We're all going to die. We all must accept as much, but not all deaths are equal. If it is a parent outliving a child, if it's a spouse or a sibling that's dying an unnatural death, particularly if it's a murder, though it doesn't have to be that severe. It can be a divorce where there's infidelity or there's been economic mismanagement, personal financial tragedy. Often what comes over us in these moments are some of the worst emotions that we can experience. Powerlessness, despair, grief, desperation. It makes you want to quit. It makes you want to just give up and quit. In the depths of those emotions, your ego comes to the rescue. You may have heard this in a number of different ways, dear listener. I know there is a psychological element to this where in psychology there is a list or there's a hierarchy of emotions. There's an emotional guidance scale that's part of spirituality, and I believe that's the Ask and It Is Given, Esther and Jerry Hicks. The theory is simply that there is a hierarchy of emotions, that you start at the bottom with your despondency, your incapacity, the overwhelming grief, despair, powerlessness where you want to quit, and then you slowly start to move up to where you reach hopefulness, optimism, ultimately joy, appreciation, freedom. In those moments of tragedy, where do you go to get back to joy, to freedom, to appreciation? How do you transverse the quagmire that is that tragedy? When your ego shows up and it is the ego of hatred, revenge, anger, blame, you don't look at any parts of yourself in that manner and say, that was helpful to me at some point in my life. That helped me transverse the quagmire that was the death of this person, the loss of this job, the breakup of my marriage. We often look at those parts of our ego, at those parts of ourselves, as the hindrance to allow us to get out of, to rise above that quagmire. And what's come through me is the fact that it simply isn't the case. When we're going through hell, as Winston Churchill said, just keep going. You don't get to just rise above it. You don't get to just put it aside and say, okay, this happened to me, and 36 hours later, I can just rise above it and it won't affect me whatsoever. There are always consequences to these tragedies. There are things that have to be done. If it's a death, you may very well have to be dealing with funeral arrangements. If it's the loss of a job, you've immediately got to go out and get another job, or you've got to manage your finances such that you can survive until you get another job. If it's the loss of a spouse, if it's a divorce, and thankfully, I know many of you haven't gone through a divorce, so you don't know all the pain, but for those of you that have, I know that on a day-to-day basis, dealing not only with the emotions of going through the divorce, but dealing with the divorce, potentially dealing with lawyers, dealing with the court. This isn't something that you can simply rise above. So to the extent that this poem, this Footprints in the Sand, has any real meaning, to me, it is that although we look at these parts of our ego that we've been told these are negative, these are holding you back, there are times in our lives where this part of our ego had to manifest, had to develop edges, and was the guiding principle, the driving force that helped us get through that terrible situation. That was God carrying us when we needed to be carried through the tragedy. Does that sound true to you, dear listener? It's hard to accept, and this is why it's taken me a while to articulate this. But does it not sound true? The real issue for us comes back to awareness. Are we aware when that part of us is still standing up and saying, it's my turn to drive. It's my obligation to get us through this situation. Awareness allows you to see these different parts of your ego, and many people want to dwell on that. Let's also expand to notice that when you are aware, you can actually see all of the different parts of you, all of these different egos. And if you are aware of the situation that you are confronting, you can actually pick and choose which part of your ego you want to feed energy to. How is the universe presenting? How is the world presenting? How is this circumstance or situation presenting to me right now? I've experienced joy. I've experienced hopefulness. I've experienced confidence. Is that what I need right now? Is that the type of situation that I'm experiencing right now? What I believe that we all want in our lives is for those types of situations to continue to manifest. And these are the types of emotions, these are the elements of our ego that we can allow, that we can feed energy to, that we can be comfortable with in our daily lives. Yet we have all of these other elements of our ego, and we are often confronted with terrible, tragic situations. Sometimes we are going to need to call on that part of our ego that came in a rage, that came in with anger, that came in with blame. As human beings that are experiencing the panoply of emotions, the panoply of experiences, of circumstances, of things that can happen in this chaotic world, are we not going to eventually need to call on some of these parts of our ego that were forged, if you will, in the fires of the tragedies that we experienced in our past? If that's the case, do we need not honor those parts of our ego when they come up? They may be exactly what we need in the moment, and if they are not, do we not have enough awareness and self-control to say, I love you, angry, rageful Patrick, and I appreciate you wanting to take the wheel during this time. I just don't need you to. You give angry, rageful Patrick a drink in a bar, he's hilarious. He's a fun time. There's some sarcasm, there's some self-deprecation. You bring that same Patrick to a charity event or a social function at work, it's awkward like an episode of The Office. It's not just simply that we need to honor all of these parts of our ego that have been honed over the course of time by all these different experiences. It's also that we need to honor that there may be more to those different parts of our ego, that they may be part of divinity, and that that's what divinity looks like. I can't preach this enough. When we ask for something and we don't allow it, it's often because we have an expectation of what it's supposed to look like. I want it immediately and it's supposed to look like this, and if it doesn't look like what I want and it doesn't manifest immediately, I'm just going to reject it. You may have asked for God to come, and God did, in a feeling of being overwhelmed, but then your feeling of frustration, and then your feeling of hopefulness, and then your feeling of optimism, and then your feeling of joy helped you get through the situation that you were in. Qualifying the ego that was you as joyful, you as optimistic or hopeful, and that being so much better than the ego that was you of frustration or feeling overwhelmed. We aren't honoring what gifts we were given when we needed the gift the most. And we can't be aware when we need that part of our ego to come back to carry us again.
Act 2, the dating app, the generational gap, and virtual reality.
Felt compelled to do another segment on the dating apps. And I'm going to focus on two phenomena that are prevalent in the dating app world, whether you're a male or a female. The first phenomenon is illuminating in how the phone, this technology, is changing all of us. And that although we see there being some sort of generational gap, that there's this change in the way that young people interact with each other and with other types of people, get onto a dating app and you'll find that that phenomenon is widespread well enough that it's affecting people in their 40s and their 50s, and for all I know, probably in their 60s, if not 70s. Although we are so closely tied now because of social media, because of these dating apps, because of the phone, the technology that's in our pocket, we have this false impression about how well connected we are to people in reality, in the real world. And the fact is that we're more disconnected than we ever were. Now, we want to blame technology, but it's not the technology, it's us. I will go into great detail in this regard. The second phenomenon, and this one is hilarious, because I do not have the social media accounts. I never grew up with them. I don't participate in an individual way right now. I'm only using social media to promote this podcast. It's the perfection that's represented in these dating app profiles. Now, many of you, dear listeners, are sitting back and saying, no shit, jackass, that's been going on now for 20 years. But have you looked beneath what it actually is? It is the substance for, it is the foundation of this isolationism. When you have represented yourself as perfect, you are in that frozen moment in time stuck. You can't actually meet anyone. You can't have any meaningful interaction with them because you're constantly in your own mind trying to live up to a lie, a standard that you've set for yourself that you know is a fiction. I will be discussing that in much greater detail as well. Phenomenon number one, the universal nature of how the phone, these apps, this technology turns us all into isolationist hermits. Evaluate 90% of all the interactions that you have with people in your daily life. What is the degree of substance involved in these conversations, in these interactions, dealing with people that you work with, dealing with people that you interact with in a service industry capacity? You've heard the term before, dear listener, work family. You often spend more time with the people that you work with than the people that you are related to, that you are married to, the people that you have sired. These are not the most substantive of relationships. There's things that you will reveal to the people that you work with. There's certainly things that you will say or you will do to people that are waiting on you at a restaurant, at a bar, the grocery store. When you were dating, when you were trying to court the person that you want to spend time with, whether that's to get into a short-term or long-term relationship, you have to be more forthcoming. There has to be more to offer than simple pleasantries, right? Isn't that what we all expect? Yet, what's the reality? We know what it is. No one reads any of the substance of most of the posts on social media, and that's specifically true, that's particularly true on the dating apps. No one really writes anything anymore because no one reads it. It's not a male phenomenon, it's not a female phenomenon. You write these things into your profile. It is an exercise in futility. People are evaluating you on your photographs, plain and simple. And that is problematic because on Instagram, if you get the likes, if you get the follows, that's great. On a dating app, if all you're being judged by is the photographs, it's much easier for a person to connect with you on a very shallow level and then quickly disconnect from you. They haven't invested any time in reading your profile. They probably aren't investing much time in trying to match with you or connect with you. Not only is it shallow, it's very easy and it's very vapid for both males and females. Ask anyone who's been on a dating app. You have a ton of different matches. You often don't correspond with those matches very frequently, if at all. And the ones that you do correspond with, that can deteriorate in short order, where what you have after a week, 2 weeks, a month on one of these dating apps is 50, 100. For a woman, it's probably 300 different profiles that you've matched with, many of whom you've not even communicated with, most of whom you have not met. What is the natural inclination? Throw my hands up, I'm done with this, and you just disconnect. You, as this individual user, you have no qualms about doing so. I really don't know these people. I haven't interacted with them in any meaningful way. I'm not going to meet them. I'm just disconnecting. That all sounds very reasonable, does it not, dear listener? And that's the phenomenon that's occurring. Now, let's put that into the context of what I said about the generational divide, this age gap, and how younger people, they don't know how to communicate as well as older people do. They haven't been indoctrinated in social graces the way that we were in the 70s and the 80s and even into the 90s. As you may see where I'm going with this, that is all bullshit. That is all bullshit. The younger generation simply grew up with a technology that has the same effect on all of us. Yes, young people might not be able to communicate as well and may be more apt is the word that's coming through, more apt to simply ghost. And I'm sure everyone knows what that term is, but that's simply not communicating with someone ever again after having some level of substantive communication with them in the first place. You don't want to have any kind of hard conversation in your life. You don't even want to be vulnerable with the feelings that you're feeling. You certainly don't want to do that with someone that you've met via this electronic, this virtual medium. It's just easier to ignore them, to never communicate with them again. This is not the phenomenon of the 16-year-old or the 22-year-old or the 29-year-old or the 35-year-old. I have been ghosted in but 30 days on these dating apps. I have been ghosted numerous times. This is not only having substantive conversations with a woman via these apps. This is exchanging phone numbers. This is sometimes meeting, physically meeting, and never hearing from that person again. No, you're a great person. I just don't see this going anywhere. I've met women more than one time. I've met women more than one time and had the nature of that relationship escalate. And that's all I'll say. But it escalated. 2 weeks later, ghost. Don't ever hear from that person again. Now, a lot of people have trepidation about admitting as much. Like being ghosted is somehow the scarlet letter that's being placed on your forehead. Being ghosted in 2022 is like having a foreclosure on your record in the year 2009 or 10 or 2011. Moreover, being ghosted is not a reflection of the person who was ghosted. It is a reflection of the person who is doing the ghosting. Now, I would love to represent to you that all the women that I've been interacting with on these dating apps are between the ages of 23 and 32, and that I just have some sort of je ne sais quoi that draws them all in. No, I've been interacting with women in their 40s and their 50s. And this is the type of thing that women in their 40s and 50s are doing. Professional, sophisticated, elegant women will ghost you in a heartbeat. It is not a phenomenon of age. It is a phenomenon of technology. It is an opportunity. And in the face of that opportunity, no matter how you were raised, what region of the country you come from, I have no doubt this phenomenon is as equally likely to occur in Southern California as it is in Southern Florida, as it is in Southern New York, as it is in Southern Michigan. This was a strange piece for me to do because I'm the guy who comes out and calls kids kids. I'm the guy who comes out and says, I'm an old, I don't keep up with popular culture. I have been as much a propagator of the disparity between the generations, the age gap, so to speak, as anyone else. Yet this slapped me in the face, as many things do now when I see the paradox of the way that I approach things, the assumptions that I make, and then the reality of the world that comes back at me. There is no age gap when it comes to discourtesy, because we all have the opportunity to do it. And given the opportunity, most people capitalize on it. A final note, that so-called hard conversation that people believe they want to avoid, and it's a belief. There's no reality to it because most of us, particularly when you get past your 20s, you realize you're going to go out with people in a social setting and you may resonate with them, you may not. If you don't, most people are mature enough that if you say, this is not going to work for me, they'll respect it and move on. It's in our own head when we feel that other person to be desperate or needy, or as the kids like to say, see, there I go again, thirsty. When we believe them to be these things, they end up showing up as we believe them to be. If we believe most people to be mature about the way relationships actually form and the fact that they are not for everyone and you are not for everyone, that if you don't resonate, you need to move on because you don't want to waste time, you'll get that in return. And yes, it's probably one of the hardest things to do in life, particularly when you're talking about romance, when you're talking about dating, it's to be the bigger person, to have an expectation that the other person that you are trying to court and interact with is going to be as mature as you are about whether or not it's working, and then how you separate. Men, women, we're no different. We're all pleading that we want to have excellent communication, and the way that we often separate is simply ghosting someone. Truth is real, justice is real, and karma is real. Think about how often, if you're ghosting people, you are upset about the nature of the relationships that you have and how they are ending. You are creating your own prison. And you are doing so simply because a piece of technology that you have in your hand that you carry around in your pocket or in your purse makes it easy to do so. That leads me to the second phenomenon, and this is more reflective. This is the stronger piece of influence on the way that human beings interact today because of the prevalence of social media. Because I am not on social media, I am somewhat of a technological dullard. I do not see these things until later on when I'm exposed to it, and I've been exposed to it now through dating apps. We don't need the metaverse. We don't need virtual reality. The social media apps, and particularly dating apps, are a virtual reality. This is who I am by way of the photographs that I present you. This is who I am by way of the things that I write about myself. Look at this life that I'm living. Look at the life that I've created. We all agree that it's perfect, don't we? In reality, all of that is tragic bullshit. The photos are doctored. They're often staged to the point where if you saw, as I have alluded to, as I have actually spoken to in other podcast segments, if you actually saw the real life staging of the photograph, you would laugh. It's a laughably implausible scenario, but it makes for great pictures. It makes for great 3, 8, maybe 10-second video clips. Let's not focus on the fact that it's bullshit. That's the easy part. Let's focus on the fact that the user who feels compelled to present this way actually has a life to live, and what effect it has to put out this false persona on the people who do it. There's a great scene in Good Will Hunting that sums this up so much more succinctly than I ever could. Oh, you were saying, dear listener, I haven't seen Good Will Hunting? We've talked about it before. We all make mistakes. The first thing you need to do is admit that you've made a mistake. And now we're on the same wavelength, aren't we? The second thing you need to do is go out and watch Good Will Hunting. I can't say that you'll be correcting your mistake, but you'll be in a hell of a lot better position than if you've sat through your life never having seen the movie.
Don't worry about me. I know what I'm doing. Yeah, but this girl's like, beautiful. She's smart. She's fun. It's different from most of the girls I've been with.
So call her up, Romeo.
Why? So I can realize she's not that smart, that she's fucking boring? This girl's like fucking perfect right now. I don't want to ruin that.
Maybe you're perfect right now. Maybe you don't want to ruin that.
As true as it is on social media, it's especially poignant on these dating apps. You're representing yourself in photographs. You're representing yourself in the things that you write. Then you have to live up to it. Have you doctored your photos at all? Yes, men do it as much as women. Have you lied about your age? Yes, men do it as much as women. All of the things that you've represented that you enjoy, all of the things that you've represented you believe in, can you live it? Now that you've convinced someone that you're living this perfect life in this perfect lifestyle, can you actually live up to it when you meet them in person? As I stated earlier in this very segment, women probably have 100, 200, 500, 1,000 matches on some of these dating apps, and it's so daunting, they just turn and walk away from it. It's too much time to invest for what they perceive as so little return. Yet, there's another factor at play. It is this very phenomenon. Look at the life that I've created on this dating app. Look at the photos that I have. Look at the lifestyle that I'm representing. Look at the so-called values that I have purported to believe in. These are the things that I hold dear. Can that person live it when they're actually face-to-face with another human being? The fact of the matter is, it's not a gender thing. Men and women both do this. Men and women are trying to create this perfect persona on these dating apps, and men and women cannot meet that persona when sitting in front of another human being at a restaurant or bar. Thus, the dating app becomes very much like social media. It's a desperate demand for validation. I do not know that it is as equally prevalent amongst men as it is women, but certainly I've talked to women who have talked about their friend group, the cadre of women that are on these dating apps, and they will readily admit there are many of these women who are just using the app as validation. The profile is simply to see how many men they can match with, what standard of men they are, in, of course, these women's minds, and whether or not they would see them as a potential long-term mate. All of this, mind you, with no intention to ever really meet anyone in person, to ever be vulnerable with any of these people such that you could enter into a meaningful short or long-term relationship. There are hearts, there are thumbs up, there are matches or connections. In the mind of many who are on these dating apps, it's all the same. It's validation in one form or another. They've created the perfect profile. That perfect profile is being validated by other users on these dating apps, but they've trapped themselves in that perfection. They can never go out and meet someone for fear that the life that they've created in this virtual world is going to be exposed as a fraud. Once that vulnerability gets to the point where the walls are caving in, that's right, ghosting. Just ghost. Just run. Run to the next thing, hoping that the walls never cave in. I'm sure you can see it as clearly as I do, dear listener. It's a vicious cycle. One that's never going to be broken until you can be honest with yourself, just as it occurred in the movie Good Will Hunting.
People call these things imperfections, but they're not. Oh, that's the good stuff. And then we get to choose who we let into our weird little worlds. You're not perfect, sport. And let me save you the suspense. This girl you met, she isn't perfect either. But the question is whether or not you're perfect for each other. That's the whole deal. That's what intimacy is all about.
I am not perfect, and neither are any of the women that I'm trying to date on these dating apps. The question is, which one is perfect for me? That question reciprocates right back to all of the women. And whether or not it's me or some other man, they're never going to find out. None of us is ever going to find out until we're willing to take the risk and at least be somewhat vulnerable to let that opportunity blossom. This is Why Don't Vote, a podcast.